One winter afternoon in early 2015, a doctor at a psychiatric hospital in Boston, Massachusetts, was sitting in his office when he heard a knock at the door. Moments later, the door opened, and a skinny, very nervous-looking woman walked in. The doctor gestured for the woman to sit down, and then waited a moment before asking in a gentle voice how she was doing today. But the woman didn't seem to hear him. Her eyes darted around the room, not focusing on anything. But finally, she did look at him, and when she did, she told the doctor that her problem was a game. The doctor cocked his head to the side, confused, and asked her to explain further. The woman said it was a secret game, but everyone was playing it. Her parents, her classmates, even strangers around town. They thought they could hide it from her, but she knew what they were doing. The doctor nodded. He wanted to make the woman feel at ease, so he told her she'd come to the right place, and he promised he would help her. But the woman didn't react, and instead started chattering about something else entirely. Then, once she snapped back to reality, she told the doctor that she was fine for now, because she had just discovered a way to temporarily stop the game. Then, the woman kind of leaned toward the doctor's desk, like she was about to share a secret, and told him the only thing that stopped the game was not eating, like at all. She said she had barely eaten in 2 weeks. The doctor sat back in his chair and exhaled slowly. Now he realized that her situation was far worse than he thought. From Ballen Studios in Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. So, if you like today's story, please crawl inside of the Follow Button's bed and feast on several crunchy granola bars, and then without cleaning up, just remake the bed. This episode is called Hunger Games. On a late August morning in 2014, a 37-year-old graduate student named Zara Valentine stepped into a university building in Boston, Massachusetts. It was the first day of classes, and there was a big welcome event for all the new students. Zara was anxious, but also excited. After working for years in human resources, she decided to finally return to school and complete her PhD. Zara wove her way through the crowd to the sign-in table. She grabbed a name tag, then went into the main hall, where her new classmates were clustered around tables, meeting one another and enjoying some refreshments. But as Zara looked around the room, she couldn't help but notice that she was one of the oldest people in the graduate program. She had always been a good student, but she had attended college a long time ago. And so Zara suddenly worried she may not fit in with her much younger-seeming classmates. Zara took a deep breath and steadied herself. She knew it didn't do any good to get rattled on the very first day. But just then her stomach rumbled. She had been so focused on the new student orientation this morning that she had forgotten to eat. Zara made her way to the buffet table, took a plate, and loaded it with some snacks, just as the Dean of Students walked on stage. Zara listened to a speech about the noble journey of higher education as she snacked furiously on mini sandwiches. Zara waited until the Dean ended his talk before going back for seconds. One morning, a few months later, Zara sat inside of a lecture hall typing notes into her laptop as her professor went over the latest assignment. All of her classes so far had been inspiring, but also mentally exhausting. Her program covered a lot of ground quickly, and she was determined to keep up. As Zara's fingers flew across her keyboard, her mind was suddenly distracted from her professor's voice by the sound of people whispering. Zara stopped and glanced around her to see who was doing it. But the students in the row behind her had their heads down, taking notes too. Zara turned her attention back to the front, but minutes later, the whispering behind her started again. This time, she spun around much more quickly to catch the gossipers in the act. But it was the same students as before, still just totally absorbed in taking notes. They barely even noticed Zara. Zara stared at them, watching their eyes and hands as they typed. She wasn't sure, but something about their behavior made her feel like her classmates were just pretending to take notes, that they had been whispering, and this was all just a ruse. Zara did turn back around to her laptop and did her best to try to reconnect with the lecturer, but now she couldn't focus. She was far too anxious to pay attention. Later that week, Zara was walking back to her apartment near midnight after a long study session at the library. On the corner of her street, she approached a neighborhood market. Despite the late hour, a couple of people were browsing the bins of fruit out front, while a few others were inside buying groceries, and a clerk stood behind the counter listening to the radio, looking bored. Zara knew she didn't have much to eat back at her apartment, so she went inside. Zara walked along the aisles looking at pastas and breads and condiments when a strange urge suddenly gripped her. She took a box of crackers off the shelf, pretending to read the back of it, and then slipped it into her backpack. She glanced at the clerk, but he seemed to be totally oblivious, still just listening to his radio. An electric thrill suddenly flickered through Zara's body as she realized she had just gotten away with shoplifting. She tried to play it cool, but she didn't want this feeling to stop. So Zara drifted over to a different aisle and slipped a fancy mustard into her pack too. And after that, some expensive chocolate. She almost laughed at how easy this was. Her brain was buzzing. By now, Zara's bag was feeling heavy with all her stolen items, so she made her way towards the entrance like she had looked around but, couldn't find what she wanted, and then as nonchalantly as she could, she walked back out the door onto the street. And then once outside, she strolled casually down the block, and then when she was out of sight, she gradually sped up until she was full on running. Nobody came after her though, and so Zara was consumed by this feeling of total euphoria. She had never done anything like this before. Back at her apartment, Zara spread out her haul on the kitchen counter, and seeing it all there was kind of surreal. It was amazing, but also at the same time, she was starting to feel kind of disturbed, like she couldn't believe she had done this. And then Zara's euphoric high kind of came crashing down, and she suddenly wondered if she should just take all this stuff back and apologize. But she didn't, and so she just kind of sat there with her feelings, wondering what had come over her. She had never stolen anything before, but it was like tonight some other personality had taken her over. A few weeks later, just before the school went on holiday break, Zara was back in class taking notes during another long lecture. Her mind raced as she did her best to keep up. Just then, she heard a familiar murmuring behind her. Zara tried to ignore it and stay focused on the professor's words, but the voices behind her got louder. Zara whipped around to scold whoever was being so rude, but when she did, everyone near her had their heads down, typing or writing. Nobody was making any noise. But the situation made Zara's blood boil. Here she was doing her best, while other students who clearly didn't care were disrupting the whole experience for everybody else and then pretending they weren't as soon as she looked at them. So Zara decided she was going to stop this behavior today. Enough was enough. The last time her classmates had interrupted, Zara had let it slide, but no more. Just because she didn't catch them in the act didn't mean they weren't whispering. She knew what she had heard. And not only that, she was positive they were whispering about her. Whatever they were saying, Zara felt like she deserved to know. And so, with a loud scraping sound, Zara, in the middle of class, abruptly stood up from her chair. The professor heard the noise and stopped talking and looked right up at her. And soon the entire lecture hall was turned towards Zara. Zara stared back, scanning the eyes of all the students and the professor, trying to figure out who had been whispering this whole time. Their blank gazes irritated her. They all looked guilty, but Zara refused to be intimidated. She told the whole class in a loud, angry voice that she knew what they were up to. They could keep trying to hide it, but she knew they were playing a game and she was sick of it. Zara almost pitied her classmates, how trapped they were in their characters, reciting staged dialogue and acting out their assigned roles. It was all so blatant. She couldn't stand another second of it. Zara snapped her laptop shut, scooped it into her backpack, and stormed out of the classroom. The winter streets of Boston were cold and gray as Zara hurried back towards her apartment. She was eager to get home and away from all these people she couldn't trust. But as she ran down the hallway of her apartment building and approached her unit, she froze. Her front door was already wide open. Moving slowly in case there was an intruder, Zara tiptoed to the doorway and peeked inside. Furniture was knocked over, books and clothes were scattered everywhere. The place had been ransacked. Suddenly it hit her. Zara felt like a fool. Of course she'd been robbed by her own parents. She'd given them her spare key, and they must have come while she was at class. Zara knew they were in on the same game as all of her classmates and even her professor. Zara couldn't tell what her parents had stolen, but she was not about to let them get away with this. First, Zara deadlocked her door, and then she began surveying her apartment. She had a feeling that her parents had not only robbed her, but had also contaminated the place with some sort of poison. She rummaged through drawers and cabinets, looking everywhere, when her eyes suddenly landed on the refrigerator. Zara went into the kitchen and slowly opened the fridge door. Her groceries were still there where she had left them, but she knew something was off. Zara leaned in and smelled. Then she jumped back and slammed the fridge shut in disgust. She'd have to throw away all her food because everything inside of it had clearly been poisoned. Zara then picked up her phone to call her mother, Antoinette, and after a few rings, her mother answered. And Zara told her mother that if she or her dad ever came anywhere near her apartment again, Zara would hurt them. If they wanted this to get ugly, Zara wouldn't be the one to back down. Then she warned her mother to never call her again, and then Zara hung up. 1 month later, on a drizzly winter morning in February, a psychiatrist named Dr. Jonathan Lean prepared to meet with Zara at a Massachusetts psychiatric hospital for the second time. Their first meeting had been 1 month earlier when Zara had arrived at the hospital accompanied by her very shocked parents and some social workers. By the end of that very first visit, Dr. Lean had helped Zara realize that the world was not out to get her. Instead, she was clearly having some sort of mental trouble and really needed professional help. And so Zara had actually agreed to check herself into that hospital for a full month of inpatient psychiatric care. Dr. Lean diagnosed Zara as suffering from a psychotic disorder, which is a serious mental condition that causes a person to have trouble staying in touch with reality. He put her on a regimen of antipsychotic and anti-anxiety medication and ordered extensive blood tests. The blood test results revealed that Zara was not getting enough of several key nutrients. She was also anemic, which is when someone doesn't have enough healthy red blood cells to carry oxygen to the body's tissues. Anemia alone can make a person's behavior erratic, although very rarely to the degree that Zara had shown. Nevertheless, after that first meeting, Dr. Lean had prescribed Zara a variety of vitamin supplements to combat her anemia, along with the other drugs to help with her mental disorder. And so now, after a full month of care was finally done, Dr. Lean was eager to see how Zara was doing. Tomorrow was her final day of inpatient treatment, and Dr. Lean was hoping that his prescriptions had helped her get back to her usual self. Right on time, there was a knock at the door, and then Zara entered and took a seat. Dr. Lean's heart sank when he saw her. Zara looked as frail as when she'd arrived. Her skin was pasty and pale, and her hair looked thin and scraggly. Dr. Lean asked Zara how she was feeling, but she just shrugged. She promised she'd been taking all of the vitamins and all the medications that he'd prescribed her, but Dr. Lean wondered if she was actually telling the truth. It didn't make sense to him that the meds wouldn't have any effect. Dr. Lean was very disappointed, but he had worked in psychiatry long enough to know how incredibly complex mental health really is. Patients respond to treatments at very different rates, and it might just take a bit longer for Zara to feel the effects of all of these medications. And so, Dr. Lean congratulated Zara on sticking with her treatment for the full month as promised, but told her that the next day her parents would be coming to take her home. He said he hoped that Zara would keep taking her medications until she fully recovered. Zara nodded blankly and stood to leave. As she did, Dr. Lean reminded Zara that she was always free to call him if she ever needed help, but Zara was already out the door and did not appear to be listening to him. The next day, Zara's mom, Antoinette, held her husband Robert's hand as they walked across the parking lot and into the lobby of the hospital where Zara had been staying. A receptionist at the counter told them that their daughter would be down soon. A few minutes later, Antoinette heard footsteps echoing down the hallway. She turned to see a nurse pushing Zara out in a wheelchair. Zara looked gaunt and exhausted. Antoinette rushed to give her daughter a hug, and when she did, her daughter's body felt like a bag of bones. Antoinette tried to be grateful that at least her daughter seemed calm, rather than hostile like before. She hoped this was maybe the first sign of improvement. Maybe her old self would return once she was settled back at home. Robert grabbed Zara's bag while Antoinette led Zara out of the building towards their car. But the drive home was very strained. Antoinette, at one point, tried to make conversation by asking Zara how the food was at the hospital, but Zara just shrugged. She said she hadn't really eaten much while she was there. Antoinette shot a worried look at her husband behind the wheel. And then a moment later, Zara told her parents that the doctors had all been gossiping about her, and the only way to stop the game was to stop eating. So she basically threw away most of her meals. Most days, Zara said she limited herself to a slice or two of bread and some water. Antoinette felt crushed. Zara's delusions had obviously not changed at all. She didn't know what to do or even where to turn for help. Eight months later, a primary care physician named Dr. Maggie Portis was studying Zara's file a few minutes before Zara was set to arrive for her appointment. Zara's story really intrigued Dr. Portis. Zara did not drink alcohol, she had never suffered a head injury, and she had no family history of mental health issues. And yet, she'd spent a month at a psychiatric hospital for delusional behavior without showing any signs of getting better. According to her family, her delusions were still as strong as ever. Since being released from the hospital, Zara had gone to a number of doctors who determined that she had a vitamin deficiency as well as a thyroid issue. Zara was given supplements to boost her iron and vitamin B, and her thyroid issue was treated successfully. But none of those treatments had any effect on her mental health. She was still totally delusional. While Dr. Portis was lost in thought, a nurse notified her that Zara and her mother were waiting for her in an examination room. Dr. Portis headed down the hall, eager to meet her new patient, but the moment she entered that exam room, she was struck by how hollowed out and desperate Zara looked. Dr. Portis introduced herself, then had Zara undress and step on the scale. Zara weighed only 99 pounds, despite being 5 foot 6 inches tall. Dr. Portis then had Zara sit on the examination table, while a nurse came and tied Zara's arm with a tourniquet, swabbed an area with an alcohol pad, and filled a syringe with her blood. Zara seemed to barely notice any of this. After the nurse left the room, Zara complained to Dr. Portis that she had been taking all of her prescribed vitamins and medications, but did not feel any better. Dr. Portis nodded. As Zara talked, the doctor suddenly had a hunch about why Zara was not getting any better. If her hunch was right, then of course Zara's meds wouldn't have had an effect, and her delusions would continue. Choosing her words very carefully, Dr. Portis told Zara that she thought she knew what might be causing her mental problems, but she wouldn't be able to tell for sure unless Zara had a procedure done. Zara's eyes lit up at the idea, and she immediately agreed to do whatever it took to make a change. She said she just wanted her old life back. Dr. Portis felt deep empathy for Zara. It was clear that she was afflicted by something that she really had no control over. Dr. Portis wrote down a name and a phone number on a notepad and handed it to Zara. She explained that it was contact information for a doctor who could perform a biopsy, which is a surgical procedure where tissue is removed from the body and then examined under a microscope. She promised Zara the procedure would be quick and painless, and it might bring her closer to solving her health issues. Zara clutched the piece of paper with both hands and thanked Dr. Portis. Then she sighed and leaned her head on her mother's shoulder and went limp with exhaustion. Dr. Portis wished Zara luck and then left them to have a moment alone. 2 weeks later, on a cloudless morning, a gastroenterologist, which is a doctor who specializes in diagnosing and treating diseases and conditions that affect the digestive system, named Dr. Simon Reed, shook his head in amazement as he surveyed the biopsy results of a patient's small intestine. In all his years in medicine, he had never seen a case quite like this one. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door, and Zara entered. She looked thin and very nervous. Dr. Reed thanked her for coming in and told her to take a seat, and then he asked her how she'd been doing. Zara looked away from the doctor and out the window and then down at her hands. She told the doctor she felt like her real life was behind her now. She used to feel like she was just entering a promising new chapter, being back at school to finish her PhD, enjoying her own apartment in the city, and thriving in her studies. But then everything just kind of went off the rails. She started doing these weird impulsive things without understanding why. It became hard to tell what was real and what wasn't. She couldn't trust anyone anymore either, like her parents. She couldn't trust them. She couldn't even trust herself. Dr. Reed was moved by Zara's story. He could tell that she was desperate for help, but didn't know where to turn, which was why he was so happy to be able to be the bearer of good news. He told Zara that her primary care physician, Dr. Portis, had been smart to tell her to go get a biopsy. because it led to the breakthrough Zara had been looking for. The tissue sample they had taken during the biopsy showed that all of Zara's physiological and mental symptoms were being caused by the same condition, and best of all, it was treatable. Zara would only have to make one life change, altering her diet. At the word diet, Zara's body froze. She narrowed her eyes and squinted at Dr. Reed like she was trying to read his mind. He recognized it as the paranoid behavior detailed in Zara's file. She suffered from the delusion that basically everyone was lying and no one could be trusted. But Dr. Reed promised Zara that he really was telling the truth, that this was the only way for her to get better. If she changed her diet, the delusions she was experiencing would go away. If she didn't change her diet, her delusions would only get worse. But the look on Zara's face told the doctor that she was not buying any of this. She scowled at Dr. Reed and shook her head in disgust. Then she got to her feet and moved to leave, but then stopped by the door and turned back around. She pointed a finger at Dr. Reed and accused him of being part of the game like everybody else, another traitor and liar trying to trick her with food. She told him that she wasn't going to fall for it, and then slammed the door and stormed out. Dr. Reed just sat there motionless, unsure what to even do. He was completely stunned by what had just happened. Several months later, on an overcast spring morning, Antoinette Valentine huddled in the front seat of the family car next to her husband, Robert. She felt a sense of dread hanging over them. Antoinette looked out the window at the familiar silhouette of the state psychiatric hospital, a sight she had seen too many times lately. But she hoped today would be the last. Her daughter Zara was finally being released following a court-ordered 3-month confinement. After storming out of Dr. Reed's office 6 months earlier, Zara's life had totally unraveled. She stopped picking up phone calls or checking in with anybody. She failed to fill out the forms necessary to continue her PhD program. She quit paying rent on her apartment and soon got evicted. And before long, she was wandering the streets. Antoinette had not heard from her daughter in months until she had showed up at the family home, banging on the door in the middle of the night, acting completely erratic and strange. Antoinette tried to calm Zara down, but there was no reasoning with her. Robert had no choice but to call the police, who handcuffed Zara and took her away. Later, after Zara made more threats against them, Antoinette and Robert filed a restraining order against their daughter. Weeks after that, the phone rang in the middle of the night, and Antoinette immediately had a bad feeling. It was a nurse from a local emergency room with news that Zara had attempted suicide. She had been found alone and unresponsive, but fortunately, medics had been able to revive her. Since Zara's mental state was extremely fragile, she was being transferred back to the state psychiatric hospital, and so that was 3 months ago. But today, finally, Zara was being sent home. Antoinette took a deep breath, braced herself, and held her husband's hand as they walked into the lobby of the hospital. The receptionist told them that their daughter would be out soon. Antoinette could not stop pacing around the lobby as they waited. The last time she'd seen her daughter, Zara had been violent and disturbing. Antoinette worried that when she saw her daughter again, she would still be emaciated, or that she'd scream and throw a fit and refuse to go home. Antoinette's memory of their last encounter was still a fresh wound in her mind. But just then, there was the sound of footsteps, and Antoinette spun around. It was Zara, and she seemed like her old self, the one Antoinette remembered before all this started. Zara was clear-eyed and smiling sweetly like she really was seeing her parents for the first time in a long time. Antoinette couldn't believe it. She rushed to her daughter and wrapped her arms around her, and this time it felt like there was actually something there to hug. Zara was a healthy, normal weight again. Zara even hugged her mother back. Antoinette stepped back and looked her daughter up and down. She was speechless. Zara had this beautiful outfit on, and her skin had a healthy glow to it. Antoinette couldn't believe such a huge mental and physical transformation was possible in just a few months. What was even more amazing was that Zara's transformation was the result of something so simple. For the past 3 months, Zara had been eating only particular foods prepared by the hospital, following the recommendations made by Dr. Reed 6 months earlier, the one who suggested Zara change her diet. And now Antoinette saw proof that Dr. Reed had been right all along, just by looking at her healthy daughter smiling right in front of her. Zara's incredible improvement was entirely due to the fact that she stopped eating foods that contained gluten, a protein commonly found in foods like bread, pasta, pizza, and cereal. Dr. Reed had discovered that Zara suffered from celiac disease, which caused her body to have a severe reaction to any foods containing gluten. Though many people are diagnosed with celiac, often as adults, Zara's condition was the worst doctors had ever seen. Zara's immune system attacked the gluten that she ate so fiercely that it damaged her small intestine. Over time, her intestine became too inflamed to absorb vitamins or iron, no matter how many supplements she took. That's why she was so anemic and thin. But even worse, gluten triggered inflammation in Zara that didn't just affect her intestine, but also her brain too. In Zara's case, inflammation caused her brain to misfire, resulting in delusions and psychosis. She starved herself intentionally and became wildly suspicious of the people around her while starting to commit crimes herself. Not because she wanted to, but because it was like her brain was malfunctioning. But once Zara started a gluten-free diet, her inflammation subsided and the delusions were gone. Antoinette and Robert were ecstatic to have their sweet daughter back. The drive home from the hospital that day was one of the happiest in their family's history. Zara was affectionate to her parents and seemed very grateful to be thinking normally again. Zara understood now that gluten really was to blame for her life spiraling out of control, and so now all she wanted to do was make up for more than 1 year of lost time with her parents. Unfortunately, though, their joy as a family was very short-lived. A few months after Zara came home, Zara accidentally ate some food that contained gluten. Her delusions returned, but this time far more intensely. Once again, Zara became convinced that her parents were plotting against her, and this time she wanted to do something about it. Driven by her paranoid hallucinations, Zara went to her parents' house and tried to kill them. Thankfully, police arrived before anybody got hurt, but Zara was sent to jail. Unfortunately, we have no information on what happened to Zara after that, but her and her family's life has been forever damaged. All because of a little protein found in a slice of bread or a plate of pasta. On February 12, 1999, 42 Carol Sund, along with her 15-year-old daughter Julie and Julie's longtime friend Silvina Peloso, who was 16 years old, boarded a plane in Eureka, California. After a quick 1-hour-long flight, they landed in San Francisco and then got their bags from baggage claim and then walked over to the airport's car rental center. After Carol signed some rental agreement paperwork with the person at the front desk, they were given car keys, and then the three women walked out of the airport into the parking lot where they saw their car. It was a 1999 red Pontiac Grand Prix sedan. After the women had put their luggage in the trunk, they all climbed inside, and then Carol began driving east towards the University of the Pacific in Stockton, California. Julie was competing in a cheerleading competition the following day at that university, and Julie was considering going to this school after she graduated high school, and so this cheerleading competition was a great excuse for her and her mom to check out the campus, and since Silvina was already visiting Julie at her home in Eureka, she just tagged along for the trip. After an hour-and-a-half long drive, the trio arrived in Stockton, California, and they checked into a hotel, and then the next day, which was the 13th, Julie competed in this cheerleading competition, and then afterwards, her mom, and Silvina spent the rest of the day checking out the campus and the surrounding town. Early the next morning, which was the 14th, the women checked out of their hotel and then drove 3 hours southeast to the sprawling motel complex called Cedar Lodge that was located just outside of Yosemite National Park's western entrance. Their plan was to spend a couple of days sightseeing inside of Yosemite before heading back to the San Francisco airport, where they were going to meet Carol's husband and Julie's father, Jens, and then the four of them would continue their journey and fly to Arizona, where they would explore the Grand Canyon before finally heading back home to Eureka, California. So midday on the 14th, these three women arrive at the Cedar Lodge, and the lot would have been nearly empty because it was the winter time and not that many people were visiting the park at that time. So they pull into the lot, they park their car, they go into the front desk where they checked in and they got their keys, and then they left the office and walked along the row of first floor rooms all the way to the very corner of the building to room 509, which was their room. Carol used her key, she opened the door, they went inside and dropped their luggage, and then they decided that they were just too tired to actually actually go in the park and go sightseeing that day. So instead, they kind of had a low-key afternoon and evening, mostly in their hotel room. The next morning, which was the 15th, the women got up early, they hopped in their red rental car, and they drove to the western entrance of Yosemite. They went inside, they parked their car, and they have this wonderful day looking at these astonishing cliff sides and snow-covered mountains and these huge sequoia trees and these beautiful meadows that stretched out in front of them. And then towards the end of the day, Julie and Sylvina actually went ice skating on a frozen pond. So it was just this totally magical day at the park. And then finally, as the sun was starting to go down, the trio finally left the park, got in their rental car, and drove back to the Cedar Lodge. There, they ate dinner at the lodge's 1950s style diner. They ate hamburgers, and then afterwards they swung by the front desk and rented some VHS movie tapes that they brought back to their room. Once they were inside room 509, the women changed into their pajamas and then sat on the bed and watched one of their movies, and then when it was over, they brushed their teeth and then they got in bed, turned out the light, and tried to go to sleep. But a few minutes after their lights were out, they heard a knock on their door. The following day, which was the 16th, Jens, Carol's husband and Julie's father, was anxiously waiting at the San Francisco airport for his wife and his daughter's friend. And he's looking at his watch and he knows they don't have that much time before their flight is going to take off. And he's just hoping they're going to come running around a corner and they're going to barely make this flight. But they don't. And finally, Jens, who does not have a cell phone, and neither does Carol, he decides there must have been some sort of miscommunication and that Carol and the girls must have flown on ahead. And so he decides at the last minute to just board the flight himself and fly to Arizona in hopes his family will be there. But when he touches down in Arizona, his family is not there. And so he rushed to the hotel hoping that maybe they were there. They weren't. He spoke to the hotel's front desk and said, hey, has my wife Carol contacted you? And they said, no, she hasn't contacted us and we have no record of her being here. And so Jens is obviously very upset. He's very worried, and he spends the rest of the day calling around to friends and family and acquaintances and anybody who might know where Carol and the girls are. But nobody has heard from them and nobody knows where they are. And so that night, as Jens is about to go to bed, he convinces himself that they are probably just fine. This is just some screw up. Carol is an unbelievably fierce woman. She's incredibly competent. She will take care of those girls, and I'm sure I will see them tomorrow morning. But when he woke up the next morning and Carol had not made any contact with the hotel or reached out to him in any way, and there was just no sign of her or the girls, Jens finally contacted police. That day, after the police spoke with Jens, the first call they made was to the Cedar Lodge, which is the last place they knew Carol, Julie, and Sylvina had been. The manager of the lodge would tell police that he had not seen Carol or the girls on the day they were supposed to check out, which was the 16th. But Carol had checked out in advance, so the manager would not have seen her anyways. She would not have had to go by the front desk on the way out. So that was not an anomaly. The manager also told police that on the 16th, after the three women should have been out of their room, the cleaners went by room 509, and when they went inside, it was vacant and nothing seemed amiss. It was relatively clean, minus some wet towels that had been left on the floor of the bathroom. The keys to the room were left on the desk as they should be. It just looked like the women had left. And so the police reached out to the car rental company at the San Francisco airport to see if Carol had made it to the airport and dropped off her car. But when they spoke to the manager of this rental company, they would say, no, Carol has not dropped off her car, and she hasn't called about extending her lease, which is now overdue. Based on the information the police gathered from the lodge and from the rental car company, they began operating on the theory that the three women left their lodge motel room on the 16th and then either got into a car accident somewhere and had just not been found yet, or they had driven somewhere, gotten out of their car and gotten lost, perhaps inside of Yosemite National Park or some other trail somewhere, or they had fallen victim to some crime. But at this point, the police were not taking seriously the idea that foul play was involved. A massive search was launched in and around the Cedar Lodge complex, as well as around the western entrance of Yosemite, but absolutely nothing was found. A number of workers from Cedar Lodge were interviewed by police and subsequently cleared of any wrongdoing. Also, a number of friends and family of the three women were also interviewed by police and cleared as well. Then, a few days after this search has started, there was a break in the case. Carol's wallet, with her ID and credit cards inside of it, was found lying on the ground in Modesto, California, which was a suburb that was located about 2 hours west of Cedar Lodge. Some high school students saw it on the ground and gave it to a police officer. There was no reason for Carol and the girls to be in Modesto, California, and so this signaled to police that a third party had to have been involved in their disappearance. And so if that was the case, then almost certainly these three women had fallen victim to some sort sort of crime. Over the next several weeks, police continued to search the roads and trails in and around Cedar Lodge and the western entrance to Yosemite, and they looked all over Modesto. But besides this wallet being found, there were no further developments with the case. Then on March 18th, which is about a month after the three women originally went missing, a hiker was way off in the middle of this forest about 2 hours north of Cedar Lodge and about an hour and a half northeast of Modesto, California, when he turned onto this logging road that nobody really ever went down. And as he's walking down this road, he sees up ahead the skeleton of a car. It looks like a car had been set on fire. And so he calls it into police, not really knowing what he's looking at. The police come out and they're able to identify this car. This shell of a car is the red rental car that Carol and the girls had been using. When they searched the car, the inside, the main cabin of the car, there really was nothing left. There looked to be some remnants of some suitcases and maybe some clothing, but mostly it was just the frame of the car and some springs. But when they opened the trunk of the car, they made a grisly discovery. Inside were two very badly burned bodies with their hands still bound behind their backs. Using dental records, they were able to confirm the bodies belonged to Carol and Sylvina. But there was no sign of Carol's daughter, Julie, the 15-year-old. She was not in the car, around the car, or in the surrounding areas. And so there was this glimmer of hope that maybe if law enforcement acts fast enough, they can find Julie and save her before it's too late. But all hope was lost when just a couple of days into this search around the car, when they still hadn't found anything, the police received an anonymous handwritten letter. And on this letter was this crude map that showed this very specific spot overlooking a lake. It was Don Pedro Lake, which was located about an hour to the south of where the car was. And then on this note as well was a phrase. It just said, "We had fun with this one." Using this crude map, the police went to Don Pedro Lake. They went up to the overlook as marked on this map, and there they looked down and they saw the crumpled and badly decomposed remains of Julie. At this point, police already had several suspects they had picked up in Modesto, California, that they believed were connected in some way to what happened to these three women. Of these suspects, two were of particular interest to the police. They were half-brothers Eugene Dykes and Michael Larwick. They had been arrested shortly after Carol's wallet had been found for shooting at a Modesto police officer and for several drug charges and for violating their parole. Once these half-brothers were in custody, Eugene made several self-incriminating remarks, basically insinuating that he and Michael had been involved in what happened to these three women. And then after Carol, Sylvina, and Julie's bodies had been found, the synthetic fibers that were found all over Carol matched the synthetic fibers that were pulled off of Michael and Eugene on their clothing and from their vehicle when they were arrested. And so the police were very confident that they had their killers and they had them behind bars already. But they still needed to compile evidence before they could formally charge them and make their names public to the media. And so when the news broke about the women's bodies being found and the public began panicking about a killer or killers on the loose, the police came out and said, "Everybody calm down. We have the people responsible. We just can't tell you who they are yet. You need to be patient. We're building the case, but everybody's safe. There's nothing to worry about." But 4 months went by and the police still had not come out and publicly charged anyone with these murders, but they continued to assure the public that they had their killers behind bars, and so nobody has anything to worry about. On the afternoon of July 22nd, roughly 4 months after the discovery of the three bodies, Dr. Desmond Kidd, who was the medical director for Yosemite, had just finished a long 24-hour shift in the clinic, and he had just gotten back to his cabin, which was inside of Yosemite, when his pager went off. And so he went to a phone, he dialed the number that was on his pager, and the park dispatcher picked up and said, "Hey, Dr. Kidd, can you be a part of a search for a missing person?" And Dr. Kidd said, "Sure, I'd love to help." And then there was a pause, and the park dispatcher said, "Hey, just so you know, there are law enforcement implications with this one." And then before he could clarify, he hung up the phone. And so Dr. Kidd is really confused what he meant about these implications, because in the past 3 years he had worked at this park, he had unfortunately been involved in many searches for missing people in the park, but they were never tied to any sort of criminal activity. They were always because the person got lost or fell or something, which was fairly common inside of the park. And so as soon as this convoy of other Yosemite staff members that are part of the search rolled up in front of his cabin, Dr. Kidd ran outside, he hopped in one of the vehicles, and he asked the driver, "What's going on? What are these law enforcement implications with regards to this missing person?" And the driver would explain to him that, hey, 4 months earlier, we had those 3 Yosemite tourists go missing, Carol, Julie, and Sylvina, and they were found murdered outside of Yosemite. And while the police have said they they have their killers behind bars, the police still have not come out and actually named who their killers are or charged anyone in their murders. And so that's made many of us think that maybe they don't have the killer or killers behind bars. Maybe there's a killer or killers still on the loose. And unfortunately, tonight we have another person who's gone missing inside of the park. And she's gone missing under very mysterious circumstances, which has led many of us to think that it's possible, if there really is a killer out there, they've struck again tonight. Dr. Kidd was totally shocked at this news, but he was even more shocked when he discovered who it was that was missing. It was somebody he knew. Her name was Joey Armstrong, and she was a 26-year-old naturalist employed by Yosemite. A naturalist is like an expert tour guide that knows everything about the park. Dr. Kidd and the rest of the convoy of Yosemite staff that were going to be a part of the search sped around the corner and went down this unmarked road with huge trees on either side, and then eventually they came out of this heavily forested road and they entered into this unbelievably beautiful meadow. And on the very far end across this huge meadow is this one green cabin sitting at the base of this mountain with a forest on the other side of it. This totally secluded cabin in the middle of Yosemite was where Joey was living. As Dr. Kidd and the convoy went across this meadow and got closer to this cabin, Dr. Kidd could see park rangers walking around the perimeter of the cabin, marking it off with yellow police tape. When Dr. Kidd and his vehicle came to a stop right outside of the marked off area, they got out and they could see parked right next to the cabin was this white pickup truck. It was Joey's pickup truck, and inside of it was a bunch of luggage, and it looked like there was luggage that had spilled out onto the ground and some of the doors were still open. And so it gave Dr. Kidd and the rest of the searchers the impression that Joey must have either been loading things into her truck or unloading things out of her truck at the time she went missing. Dr. Kidd and the rest of the searchers kind of huddled up with the park rangers, and the rangers explained that Joey's friends that were living in San Francisco were expecting Joey to arrive at their house the day before, but when she didn't and they couldn't get in touch with her, they had called it in, and that's why they were there looking for her. And so after talking about the circumstances of the case, they all decided they would break into 5 different search groups, and they would begin searching the immediate area. Dr. Kidd and 4 other searchers began walking behind the cabin towards the tree line, and then once they got into that forest, they started walking towards this creek. And as they walked up along this creek, they suddenly noticed a whole bunch of trampled ferns and saplings, and it looked like someone had come running through there, and perhaps the person who was running was Joey. And so they began following these tracks that go right alongside this creek, and then at some point, one of the searchers yells out, "Hey, what's that up there?" And about 10 feet ahead of them, where the ground kind of sloped down into a ditch out of view, right before the ditch, hanging on a little tree on the ground, was a set of car keys glinting in the sunlight. And so Dr. Kidd, who was at the front of his small search party, he began walking towards these keys, and as he got closer and closer, he began to be able to see down into this ditch right on the other side of these keys. And as soon as he could actually see what was at the bottom, he immediately began to gag, and he turned around and quickly walked away. The other 4 searchers, they walked up and they had a look down, and they too had a similar reaction. And before long, the group was running back to the cabin to tell the park rangers what they had just discovered. When the rangers heard about what was in the forest, they immediately contacted the police, and the police sent a police officer to Joey Armstrong's mother's house, which was just outside of San Francisco. When the mother opened the door, the officer told her that they had just gotten a call from Yosemite and they need her to call them. And then he handed her a piece of paper with a phone number on it. Joey's mother was immediately concerned and confused and tried to get more information from this officer, but the officer just said, "Look, you're just going to have to call that phone number. I really don't know anything." And so eventually she thanked him, she shut the door, and she went into the kitchen and she dials this number. After someone picked up, she introduced herself as Joey's mother, and at that point, the person who picked up quickly handed the phone off to someone who sounded much more senior, and this person asked Joey's mother, "Are you aware that your daughter is missing?" So Joey's mother says, "No, I was not aware of that." And then this person very delicately says, "Ma'am, we believe we found your daughter's body near her cabin." Joey's mother's reaction was instant. She said, "Well, did you check her hair? She has red hair. Can you confirm it's really her? Because she's got bright red hair. Can you make sure it's really her?" And the person on the other side of the line hesitated for a minute and then just said, "Ma'am, we're not sure if she has red hair or not. We'll get back to you." And so after this call finally ended, Joey's mother was confused. How could they not know what color her daughter's hair was? That seems like such an easy way to potentially identify whether or not this was really her daughter. Why would they make her wait for something like that? And so she was horribly distraught. She didn't know what else to do. She was told to just kind of wait for more news, but she couldn't do that. And so she began planning a trip out to Yosemite to actually get out there and see what was going on. But the earliest flight she could possibly get was not until very early the next morning. And so she has this very restless night's sleep where she's just praying that this person was not actually her daughter. And then the next morning she gets up, she rushes to the airport, and as she's waiting to board her plane, she grabs a newspaper from a nearby kiosk, and the headline reads, "Naturalist Beheaded at Yosemite." And that's when she understood why that person could not tell her whether or not this was her daughter based on hair color. It's because this body did not have a head. But from the time she got that phone call to this headline running in the paper, these searchers had found the head. It was located 27 feet away under some brush, and they were able to confirm that it was the body of Joey Armstrong. Joey's death was immediately treated like a homicide, and right away the public began to openly suggest that maybe Joey's murder is connected to the murders of Carol, Julie, and Sylvina from 4 months earlier, even though the police were still saying, we have our killers behind bars for those murders. Joey's murder is completely unconnected. Luckily, the public and the police did not have to argue for very long about who was right about this, because there was a break in Joey's case almost immediately. On the night that Joey went missing, another Yosemite staff member had happened to drive by her cabin, and they noticed a distinctive SUV parked outside of her cabin that they didn't recognize. It was a blue 1979 International Scout, and as it happened, there were only 2 of these particular types of vehicles registered in Yosemite Valley. And so within 24 hours, the police had tracked down one of these 2 vehicles. It was located about 12 miles away from the western entrance of Yosemite and was pulled off the side of this highway. The police pulled up alongside it and parked. They walked up. There was no one inside of this vehicle, but then down this embankment off the highway led down to this forest where there was a river kind of out of sight that people like to swim and fish in. And so these 2 officers decide to head down and see if maybe the driver is down there. So they make their way down, and sure enough, they come in contact with the driver. He was laying on this rock, completely nude, smoking marijuana. And so the 2 officers, they come up to him and announce themselves, and this very well-built, good-looking guy stands up and he calmly covers himself, and he takes the marijuana out of his mouth and he says, "Hey, what can I do for you guys?" And so over the course of their conversation, the police would learn this guy's name was Kerry Stainer. He was 38 years old, and he was the handyman at Cedar Lodge Motel. He would tell police that he was not anywhere near Joey's cabin on the night she went missing, and the police ultimately bought it and said, okay, they confiscated his marijuana, and then they walked back up the hill, leaving him down there, and they took some pictures of his car and the tires on his car, and then they left. A couple of days later, some FBI investigators that had been called in for this case, they analyzed those pictures those officers had taken of the tires of Kerry's car, and they compared them to pictures of the tire tracks at Joey's cabin, and they determined they were a perfect match. So later that day, which was July 24th, police officers went back out and tracked Kerry down again. This time he was having lunch at one of his favorite spots. It was a nudist resort about 3 hours northwest of the Cedar Lodge. There he was arrested on the suspicion of murdering Joey Armstrong, and he was brought in for questioning. As soon as he was walked into the police station and was booked, Kerry dropped a bombshell. He confessed to not only murdering Joey Armstrong, but also he confessed to murdering Carol Sund, along with her daughter Julie Sund, and Sylvina Peloso, the friend of Julie Sund. And he did all of this on his own. He had no other accomplices, which means the police never had the killer or killers behind bars. It would turn out Eugene Dykes, who was one of their primary suspects, was lying when he made those self-incriminating remarks about he and his half-brother Michael. And as for those synthetic fibers that were found on Eugene and Michael, those fibers belonged to a very commonly sold blanket, and so they did not definitively tie Michael and Eugene to the crime. So for half a year in 1999, there really was a serial killer just roaming free in Yosemite National Park, just like many people who lived in that area and like some people in the media had speculated. Kerry would go on to give a very detailed and graphic 6-hour-long confession of how he went about killing all 4 women. This is his awful story. On February 14th, 1999, so the day that Carol, Julie, and Sylvina arrived at Cedar Lodge, Carey was on his way to his girlfriend's house. His girlfriend, like Carey, worked at the Cedar Lodge. She was a waitress at their 1950s-style diner. That night, as Carey walked up her front walkway towards her front door, he made up his mind that he was going to act on a fantasy he had had since he was 7 years old. And that fantasy was to kill a young woman. And so his plan that night was he would go inside and he would not only kill his girlfriend, but he would also kill her 2 daughters, who were 10 and 11 years old at the time. But when he went inside the house and was about to carry out this plan, he noticed out one of their windows there was a man in their backyard. And he asked his girlfriend, "Who's that guy out there?" And she would say, "Oh, I hired someone to take care of our property. So he's going to be cutting the grass and, doing some things with our garden. He's going to be here for a little bit, but he'll stay outside." And so this totally screwed up Carey's plan because he was not expecting there to be anybody there that night. And so for several hours, Carey anxiously sat there constantly looking out the window, waiting for this guy to leave so he could kill these 3 people. But the worker was just taking a lot of time and it didn't seem like he was even close to being done. And so finally, Carey left without any explanation. Angry and frustrated, he began driving back to Cedar Lodge, where he had an apartment on the 2nd floor. And when he pulled into the parking lot, he noticed there was a car he had not seen earlier in the day. It was a 1999 red Pontiac Grand Prix. And suddenly, Carey had this urge to find out who owned that car. And maybe, if he was lucky, it was a woman who owned that car, and she was potentially alone. And if that was the case, he could fulfill his fantasy on this woman and not worry about the fact that he couldn't kill his girlfriend and her 2 kids. And so Carey parked his car a little bit away from this red car, and he walked over to the room that was right in front of this red car. And it was room 509, and he peeked behind one of the curtains into the room, which was all lit up, and he couldn't believe his luck. There were 3 women inside of this room. It was Carol, Julie, and Sylvina. And so Carey stayed back and continued looking through the window just to make sure there wasn't a man inside of this room. And after a while of watching them go in and out of the bathroom and nobody coming into the room but these 3 women and no men coming into the room from the outside, he was certain they were alone. And so when Carey finally turned around and left to go back to his room, he made the decision that he was going to come back the next day and kill them. The next day, which was February 15th, Carey secretly followed the 3 women when they hopped in their rental and drove to Yosemite. He followed them to the parking lot, and then he waited in the parking lot until the women had finished going through the park and having this wonderful time. He trailed them from the parking lot back to the Cedar Lodge, and then he secretly followed them when they went to that diner and they had hamburgers for dinner. And he continued to follow them from a distance and watch them rent movies from the front desk. And he followed them all the way back to their room. And once he knew they were inside their room and he watched them long enough to confirm they were not going to leave again, he went back to his room and he got his toolbox. In his toolbox was rope, duct tape, a knife, and a gun. And then around 11 p.m., he left his apartment and went downstairs and walked all the way back over to that corner room, room 509, where the women were. And he looked in the window and it was totally dark inside, so he assumed they must be sleeping, and he knocked on the door. A few minutes later, Carol came to the door and very cautiously opened it up just a crack, leaving that chain link lock still attached. And so she looked through at Carey and said, "Hi, can I help you?" And Carey, who held up his handyman toolbox and pointed to his name tag that said he was the Cedar Lodge handyman, he said, "Hi, ma'am, sorry to disturb you so late, but there is a leak in the room right above yours, and I need to make sure the leak is not coming down into your room. So can I come in and just have a quick look, and then I'll be out of here?" And Carol apparently was just not buying it, and she said, "Look, I haven't seen any leaks in this room. I don't think there is one, but even if there is, can it please wait until tomorrow, because we're all trying to sleep." But Carey was very persistent, and Carey was known to be very charming and very disarming, and eventually he talked his way into the room. And so he walks inside, he walks past the bed where the other 2 teen girls are still sleeping, he goes into the bathroom, and for a few minutes he kind of pretends to fiddle around inside of the bathroom while Carol is standing right outside looking in at him. And then at some point, Carey reached into his toolbox, pulled out the gun, and he aimed it at Carol, and he said, "Stay calm, I'm not going to hurt you, this is just a robbery." Carol most likely believed their best chance at getting out of this situation was just to comply and do what he says. He'll rob us and then he'll leave and we'll be okay. And so Carol very dutifully went back into the room and she quietly woke up her daughter and her daughter's friend. And before long, Carey had tied up all 3 of them. He put the 2 teenagers in the bathroom and shut the door, and then he put Carol on the bed. And then he proceeded to assault Carol before
strangling her to death with more rope. And then after she was dead, he carried her body outside of the motel room and put her in the trunk of her own rental car. And then after he shut the trunk, he went back inside the motel room. He went to the bathroom, he opened it up, he grabbed Sylvina, who was crying, and pulled her out, and he left Julie alone, cowering inside the bathroom by herself. He shut the door behind her, and then he brought Sylvina over to the bed, where he assaulted her before strangling her as well to death with some additional rope. And then after Sylvina was dead, he carried her body outside of the motel and put her in the trunk of the rental car along with Carol's body. And then after that, he went back inside the motel room, and then once again he opened up the bathroom door, he grabbed Julie, pulled her out, and proceeded to assault her as well. But then afterwards, he did not strangle her to death. Instead, he walked her back into the bathroom and shut and locked the door. And while she was in there wondering what's going to happen to her, what happened to her mom, what happened to her friend, he proceeded to clean up the room and tidy it up, and he moved all of their luggage out of their room and put it into the rental car. And then after he was satisfied, he went back inside the motel room, he opened up the bathroom door, he pulled Julie out and had her stand right outside the bathroom, and then Carrie proceeded to clean up the bathroom but left a couple of wet towels on the ground to give the impression that the women had left in a bit of a hurry. And so after that, he grabbed Julie and he walked her out to the car and he sat her down in the front seat. She only had a blanket on at this point. Everything else had been taken off of her. And then Carrie hopped in the front seat and he began driving off. Julie must have been beyond terrified. She has no idea where her mom is. She has no idea where her friend is. She has no idea they're actually dead, locked in the trunk right behind her. And the man that had just assaulted her for hours is now driving her into the darkness. She has no idea where she's going, and all she's got is this blanket around her. It's just beyond brutal what's happening to this poor girl. And so for 2 hours, Carrie drove them west along the highway in the middle of the night, and the whole time he's trying to make small talk with this poor girl, trying to tell her that she's going to be okay and that her mom and her friend, they're going to be okay. And then finally he pulls off the highway down some switchbacks into this big parking lot of the Don Pedro Lake. And then once he parks the car, there's no other cars around. It's still dark out. The sun hasn't come up. He gets out and he tells Julie to get out of the car. But Julie is so scared she can't move, so she can't even get out of the car. And so Carrie gets out. He walks around to her side. He opens the door and he scoops her up like you might hold a baby. And he walked with her up the trail all the way to this overlook that was well away from any prying eyes in the parking lot. And once he was out of sight, he took her blanket off and he laid it down, and then he proceeded to assault her again. And then as the sun began to come up over the lake, Carrie realized that he had to end his fantasy and begin to cover his tracks. And so Carrie stops what he's doing. He stands up, he reaches down and pulls Julie up to her feet. And so she's standing with her back to the lake. And as he's looking at her, he says, "I love you." And then he pulls out his knife and begins hacking her throat. And then he pushes her down the hillside where she tumbles and finally comes to a stop underneath some bushes where she dies. Carrie grabbed the blanket on the ground and he walked back to the rental car in the lot. There was nobody out there, so he hopped inside. He drove out of the lot and drove 1 hour north until he was well into this forest, and he pulled down a logging road where he abandoned this car. After he ditched it, he walked back up to the highway and caught a cab back to Cedar Lodge. He would come back to the car and torch it 2 days later. He would also make a special trip to Modesto, California, where he would drop Carol's wallet in the middle of the road near a high school in order to confuse investigators. A month later, when Carol and Sylvina's body were found in the back of the burned out car, Carrie would send that handwritten note to police that had the map of where Julie's body was and that horrible message of "we had fun with this one," referencing Julie. He sent that to police in order to further confuse them. He wanted them to believe that there really was more than one person perpetrating these murders, hence the "we had fun with this one." Months would go by, and the police, despite questioning Carrie along with the other Cedar Lodge staff members, never considered him a suspect. And that was because, one, they really thought he was just a nice, normal guy and couldn't be capable of committing violence against these 3 women. And two, probably most importantly, the police discovered when Carrie was a child, his younger brother was kidnapped by a pedophile and held for 7 years. And although his brother was ultimately returned to the family alive, that experience was incredibly traumatic and devastating to Carrie. And so the police figured there's no way this guy would ever abduct or harm other people because he knows how traumatic and awful that is for the victim and the victim's family. If anything, Carrie seemed like the type of guy who would go out of his way to protect and save these 3 women from being abducted or from being harmed. In July of that year, so 4 months after the 3 women's bodies were discovered, Carrie, who believed he had completely gotten away with murder, and to that point he really had, he was just driving around Yosemite kind of reveling in the fact that he had gotten to live out this fantasy and not get punished for it, when he noticed there was this woman way off in the distance walking in and out of this cabin that was fairly isolated. And so he drove his 1979 International Scout blue SUV down this forested road, and he reaches this meadow, and he looks across this meadow, and now that this woman is even closer, he can tell she's clearly loading things into her truck, and she's going back and forth, and he's watching, wondering if there's anybody else helping her, because this cabin is very secluded, and he's thinking, if she's alone, I might be able to kill her too. And so after a while, when he only sees her loading things into her white pickup truck, he decides he's gonna go kill her. And so he drives across the meadow and he pulls up right next to her truck, and he gets out and he introduces himself. And the woman is so completely caught off guard by this random strange man showing up in the middle of the night, suddenly acting so friendly, that kind of reflexively, in an effort not to be rude, she says, "Hi, I'm Joey Armstrong. Nice to meet you. What are you doing down here?" And Carrie would proceed to spark up some small talk. He asked her if she believed in Bigfoot, and they kind of got on this tangent about Bigfoot. And then at some point, Carrie drew a pistol and he aimed it at her and said, "Go inside your cabin." And so Joey put her hands up and she went inside the cabin like she was told, and Carrie followed her inside, and then he bound her wrists and he bound her mouth with duct tape, and then he ordered her to get back inside of his SUV. And then once she was sitting inside the front passenger seat, Carrie got in the driver's seat and he began leaving the cabin, headed back out away towards that road he came in on. And as he's bombing across the meadow, Joey leaps head first out of the window of this moving car and smashes onto the ground, and she immediately jumps up and just starts running back towards the cabin. Carrie jams on the brakes, he hops out and he starts chasing after Joey, but Joey manages to get fairly close to that tree line right behind the cabin before Carrie ultimately grabs her and tackles her to the ground. And then Joey is viciously trying to fight Carrie off of her, and Carrie, kind of in a panic, draws his knife and he tries to slash at Joey, but Joey tucks her chin, protecting her neck from being stabbed. And so frustrated, Carrie just stands up and he grabs Joey by the hair and he begins hauling her towards the forest behind her cabin. And the whole time Joey's doing everything in her power to try to escape, but she just can't. And finally they get inside the woods and Carrie drags her into this ditch, and once she's down at the bottom, he puts his foot on the top of her head and forces it back, forcibly exposing her throat. And then at that point he pulls out his knife and he begins to cut. Afterwards, Carrie considered keeping Joey's head, but ultimately he would try to hide it in some bushes nearby. After Carrie attempted to cover up some of the blood in the area with some branches and leaves, he left the forest and went back to his SUV. He didn't even attempt to tidy up the scene. He left her truck as is, he left her cabin as is. He just hopped in his SUV and drove back to Cedar Lodge. Carrie would tell police that as soon as he killed Joey Armstrong, all he wanted to do was go kill his girlfriend and her 2 young daughters, the 10 and 11-year-old. But police caught him before he could carry out the attack. Cary Stayner, who never showed any remorse for his victims, was ultimately sentenced to death and is currently awaiting execution in San Quentin Prison in Northern California. One of the more distressing aspects of this case was Carol's camera that was found intact near the burned out car in the woods. The police would develop the pictures on this camera in hopes there would be some clue as to who murdered them, but it would turn out there wasn't any usable evidence on the camera. It was just pictures of Carol, her daughter, and Sylvina having this wonderful time in Yosemite, and that was it. But after Cary confessed to what he did to these poor women, those pictures take on a whole new, much darker meaning. In the final 8 images of the camera roll, we know Cary Stayner was either literally watching these women secretly at the time the picture was taken, or he was patiently waiting nearby for them to return. The final image that was taken on this camera was taken by Julie of her mother sitting on the bed and her friend Sylvina sitting on the other bed as they're getting ready to turn out the lights and go to sleep. That picture was taken just moments before Cary knocked on their door.